The day started like any other. I woke up, got dressed, and left for work after the usual rushed breakfast with Alice. She had her camera slung over her shoulder, her hair tousled but charming as ever, and a quick smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Have a good day," she said, kissing my cheek before rushing out to her photography studio. Alice was always busy, her mind full of creative projects, clients, and deadlines. I love that about her, her drive, her passion. But lately, I'd started to feel like a footnote in her life. That's why I decided to surprise her that day. I wanted to remind us, of what we had. Around lunchtime, I left work and stopped by her favorite Thai place, ordering her go-to pad see ew with extra tofu. I even got her that mango sticky rice dessert she loved. It felt good, like I was doing something thoughtful, something to make her smile. When I arrived at her studio, the familiar sight of her name painted on the frosted glass door brought a pang of warmth. Alice Morgan Photography, it read in elegant black script. I pushed the door open, balancing the food in one hand and calling out her name. No response. The studio was quiet, the kind of quiet that wraps itself around you and makes every sound feel too loud. The front room was as I expected, soft lighting, shelves lined with photo books, and Alice's award-winning portraits framed neatly on the walls. But she wasn't there. "Hello?" I called again, setting the food down on the counter. Still nothing. That's when I noticed the door at the back of the studio, slightly ajar. It was odd. Alice had always been meticulous about her workspace, doors shut, drawers organized, every camera lens in its proper place. Curious, I walked over. The door creaked as I pushed it open. Inside, the room was dimly lit by a single lamp. The air smelled faintly of chemicals, and the walls were plastered with photographs. My first thought was that it was just one of Alice's creative projects, maybe a personal series she hadn't told me about. But as I stepped closer, the details made my stomach twist. At first, I saw her face, dozens of portraits of Alice, some candid, some posed. But as my eyes moved across the room, I saw something else. Pictures of me. I froze. They weren't just any pictures. These were moments from my life, moments I hadn't even realized had been captured. Me sitting at my desk, typing away at my computer. Me reading on the couch, half hidden behind a book. Me talking on the phone in the kitchen, wearing that old sweatshirt Alice hated. The angles were odd, voyeuristic. The kind of shots you take when someone doesn't know they're being watched. A chill ran down my spine. I stepped closer, scanning the wall for some kind of explanation, some clue. The more I looked, the worse it got. There were pictures of me sleeping, my face relaxed and unaware. One of me brushing my teeth in the bathroom mirror. Another of me staring out the window, lost in thought. I couldn't breathe. Why hadn't Alice told me about this? Why were these photos here, hidden away in a room I'd never seen before? The sound of the door to the studio opening snapped me out of my daze. My heart raced as I quickly stepped out of the room, shutting the door behind me. I didn't want her to know I'd seen it, not yet. "Alice?" I called, my voice trembling slightly. She walked in, her cheeks flushed from the cold outside, a coffee cup in her hand. "Oh, hey, John. What are you doing here?" she asked, surprised but smiling. I forced a smile, my mind spinning. "Thought I'd bring you some lunch." Her eyes lit up at the sight of the takeout bag. She walked over, kissed me on the cheek, and started unpacking the food, completely oblivious to the storm brewing inside me. I couldn't bring myself to ask her about the room, not then. I didn't know how. But as I sat across from her, watching her laugh and talk about her day, all I could think about were those pictures. Who was the woman I thought I knew so well? That evening, I couldn't shake the images from my mind. The photos. The hidden room. The way Alice had carried on as if everything was normal. Her laugh at lunch had felt genuine, her smile warm, but how could it be, knowing what I'd just discovered? I tried to act like nothing was wrong, but the silence between us felt louder than usual. At dinner, I watched her move about the kitchen, pouring us glasses of wine, chatting about her day as though she had no idea what I'd seen. "Your studio's looking good," I said casually, trying to keep my tone even. Alice glanced over her shoulder with a quick smile. "Thanks. I've been reworking some projects. A lot of late nights, but I think they're coming together." I took a sip of wine, my throat tightening. I noticed a back room there. "I don't think I've seen it before." She paused for a fraction of a second before turning back to me. "Oh, that? It's just my darkroom. You know, for film work." Her tone was light, almost dismissive, but my chest tightened at the memory of those photos. "You've never mentioned it." "Well, it's nothing special," she said with a small laugh. "Just a workspace. You know how messy my projects can get." Messy wasn't the word I'd use. Obsessive, maybe. Secretive. My mind churned with questions, but I didn't press further. Not yet. I wasn't ready for whatever answers she might give, or worse, for the lies she might tell. That night, as she slept soundly beside me, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling. What were those pictures for? And why had she never told me about them? A creeping doubt began to settle in my chest, the kind that wraps around you like vines, tightening with every thought. The next day, when Alice left for the studio, I stayed behind, telling her I had work to finish at home. Once she was gone, I took a moment to steady myself. My heart raced as I unlocked her office desk drawer, a place I'd never had reason to look before. Inside, I found the usual clutter: pens, receipts, a few spare memory cards. But there was also a stack of envelopes, each marked with dates in her handwriting. I hesitated, feeling a pang of guilt for invading her privacy, but the knot in my stomach urged me on. The envelopes were full of photographs, neatly printed and carefully organized. Most were of landscapes, clients, artistic shots. But buried near the bottom of the pile were more pictures of me. These were different from the ones in the studio. They weren't candid. Some were close-ups of my face, others of my hands, my eyes, even my scars. It was intimate, almost tender. And yet, something about it felt wrong. And then I saw them. Among the pictures of me were photos of men I didn't recognize. They were sitting on my couch, wearing my clothes, drinking from my favorite mug. My chest tightened as I stared at the images. The angles were deliberate, the lighting perfect, as though Alice had staged them like she did her professional work. But why? The sound of a key turning in the front door made my blood run cold. I scrambled to put everything back as quickly and neatly as I could, shoving the drawer shut just as Alice walked in. "Hey," she called cheerfully, dropping her bag on the counter. "Change of plans, my shoot got rescheduled." I turned to her, trying to keep my expression neutral. "Oh, that's unexpected." "Yeah," she said, coming over to kiss my cheek. "What about you? Still working?" "Just about to wrap up," I replied, hoping she couldn't hear the tremor in my voice. She didn't seem to notice. As she started talking about her day, I nodded along, barely listening. My mind was spinning, trying to make sense of the pictures, the strange men, the lies that were piling up between us. That night, as I lay in bed, I made a decision. I couldn't keep ignoring what I'd seen. I needed answers, but I also needed proof, something she couldn't deny. The next morning, I ordered a small, hidden camera online and waited. It felt wrong, underhanded, but I had no choice. If Alice was hiding something, I had to know the truth. When the camera arrived, I installed it in the living room, the place where those men had been photographed. I felt sick to my stomach as I adjusted its angle, wondering what it might capture. And then I waited. The days passed slowly. Alice didn't seem to notice anything different, but I could barely look her in the eye. Every time she left the house, I checked the footage, hoping for nothing and dreading what I might find. On the fourth day, I got my answer. Sitting at my desk, I opened the camera's feed and froze. Alice was in the living room, laughing softly as she poured wine into 2 glasses. A man I'd never seen before sat on the couch, leaning back casually, as though he belonged there. He took a sip, then reached out to touch her hand. She didn't pull away. My hands trembled as I watched them, the knot in my stomach tightening with every passing second. When they kissed, something inside me broke. It wasn't just the betrayal. It was the ease, the comfort between them. This wasn't a moment of weakness, it was a life she'd built in secret, right under my nose. And now, I couldn't unsee it. The image of Alice with that man wouldn't leave my mind. It clung to me, like a shadow I couldn't shake. My chest tightened every time I thought about it, and my thoughts spiraled into dark corners I never imagined I'd visit. Who was he? How long had this been going on? And why? That night, Alice acted as though nothing had happened. She laughed at the TV, sipped her wine, and even curled up next to me on the couch. I forced myself to play along, nodding at her stories and pretending to enjoy the movie. But my stomach churned with every fake smile I gave her. I needed to confront her, but not yet. I wanted her to feel the weight of the truth, to see the undeniable evidence. Confronting her now, without preparation, would only give her the chance to lie her way out of it. The next morning, while she was in the shower, I checked the camera feed again. It confirmed what I already knew: the man had left shortly before I got home. Alice had cleaned up their mess, erased the surface evidence, but the camera didn't lie. I spent the day putting my plan into motion. I called a friend of mine, Tom, who worked in private security, and asked for advice. He didn't ask many questions, just told me how to protect myself and suggested upgrading my surveillance. By that evening, I had hidden cameras installed in several parts of the house. The living room. The kitchen. Even the hallway leading to our bedroom. It felt invasive, even cruel, but I couldn't stop myself. I needed to see the full picture of what was happening in my own home. The next few days passed in tense silence. I avoided Alice as much as I could, claiming work deadlines and long hours. She didn't seem to notice, or maybe she didn't care. I couldn't decide which was worse. Then, on a Thursday night, the truth came crashing down. Alice told me she had a late meeting with a client and wouldn't be home until after 10. I feigned indifference, watching her pack her bag and leave with a quick goodbye. As soon as the door clicked shut, I rushed to my laptop and pulled up the live camera feed. At first, the house was empty. Quiet. Then, just after 8:30, the front door opened, and a man stepped inside. It wasn't the same one I'd seen before. This one was older, with salt and pepper hair and a confident air. He moved through the house like he'd been there before, setting a bottle of wine on the counter and calling out, "Alice." She appeared moments later, smiling as though she'd been waiting for him. They embraced in the kitchen, her arms draping around his neck. My throat tightened as I watched them kiss. The evening unfolded like a nightmare. They laughed and drank, moving from the kitchen to the living room. She leaned into him on the couch, their conversation quiet and intimate. At one point, he pulled her onto his lap, and she buried her face in his neck, laughing softly. I couldn't watch anymore. I slammed the laptop shut and leaned back in my chair, staring at the ceiling. My hands trembled with rage, humiliation, and an overwhelming sense of betrayal. This wasn't just a mistake or a lapse in judgment. This was calculated. Repeated. Alice was living a double life, and I was the fool who hadn't seen it. But now I had proof. The next day, I told Alice I wanted to cook her dinner. A romantic evening at home, just the two of us. She looked surprised, maybe even suspicious, but she agreed with a smile. I spent the day preparing, setting the table with candles and her favorite dishes. The wine was chilled, the lighting perfect. To anyone else, it would have looked like a gesture of love, but for me, it was a prelude to the storm. When she walked through the door that evening, her face lit up. "Wow," she said, looking around. "What's the occasion?" "No occasion," I said, forcing a smile. "Just wanted to do something nice." We ate in relative silence, the clinking of silverware the only sound between us. I couldn't help but watch her, studying every movement, every flicker of her expression. Did she feel guilty? Did she suspect that I knew? Finally, as the meal wound down, I leaned back in my chair and looked at her. "Alice," I said, my voice calm but firm. "Can I ask you something?" "Of course," she replied, sipping her wine. "Do you love me?" Her brow furrowed, and she set down her glass. "What kind of question is that?" "Of course, I do." "Then why are you lying to me?" The color drained from her face. "What are you talking about?" I reached for the tablet I'd placed on the counter earlier. With a few taps, I pulled up the video feed from the previous night and set it on the table in front of her. She stared at the screen, her eyes wide as the footage played. The man. The kisses. The laughter. Her betrayal laid bare in glowing pixels. "John," she whispered, her voice shaking. "I can explain." But I didn't want her explanations. Not yet. I wanted her to see what she'd done, to feel the weight of the truth. "Don't," I said, my voice sharper than I intended. "Don't insult me by pretending this is something it's not." She reached for my hand, but I pulled away. "Please," she pleaded, tears welling in her eyes. "Let me explain. It's not what you think." "Then what is it, Alice?" I snapped, my patience finally breaking. "Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you've been lying to me for months. Years, maybe." She didn't answer, just stared at me with a mixture of fear and guilt. I stood, my chair scraping against the floor. "You know what? Save it. I've heard enough." I grabbed my jacket and headed for the door, her voice chasing after me. But I didn't stop. Not this time. As I stepped into the cold night air, I realized that the person I'd trusted most in the world had become a stranger. And no matter how much it hurt, I couldn't go back. I spent the night driving aimlessly, the cold air seeping through the car windows. My mind replayed Alice's tears, her desperate attempts to explain, and the damning images from the hidden camera. By the time I returned home, the streets were silent, and the first traces of dawn were stretching across the horizon. The house was dark when I stepped inside. Alice was on the couch, wrapped in a blanket, her face pale and streaked with tears. She looked up as I entered, her eyes red and swollen. "You came back," she whispered, her voice hoarse. I didn't respond, just closed the door behind me and sat down in the armchair across from her. The silence between us was thick, suffocating, but I needed to hear her say it. I needed to understand why. "I know I have no right to ask," she began, her voice trembling, "but please, please let me explain." I leaned forward, resting my elbows on my knees, my gaze fixed on her. "Then explain." Alice hesitated, her fingers gripping the edges of the blanket like a lifeline. "It started, a year ago. I didn't plan for it to happen. I didn't even realize it was happening at first. I was just lost, John. I felt invisible. Like I was fading into the background of your life." "Invisible?" I repeated, my voice rising despite myself. "So this is my fault?" "No," she said quickly, shaking her head. "It's not your fault. It's me. I should have talked to you. I should have told you how I felt, but instead, She broke off, covering her face with her hands. "You what?" I demanded, my voice cold. "You found someone else? Or rather, several someone else's?" She flinched, her hands dropping to her lap. "It wasn't like that. Not at first. The first man, he was just a friend. Someone I met at a gallery opening. We talked about photography, art. It was harmless. But then..." "Then what?" Her voice cracked. "Then it wasn't. And once it started, I didn't know how to stop. I hated myself for it, but it was like I couldn't control it. It wasn't about love or passion, it was about feeling seen. Feeling alive." I stared at her, the woman I thought I knew, and felt a wave of disbelief wash over me. "You're trying to tell me this was some kind of existential crisis? That it wasn't about them, it was about you?" "Yes," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "But I know that doesn't excuse it." nothing can excuse it. For a moment, I was silent, my hands gripping the arms of the chair. Her words were raw, desperate, but they didn't erase the images burned into my mind. "Do you know what it's like," I said finally, my voice trembling with restrained anger, "to watch your wife, the woman you've built your life with, betray you in your own home? To see her laugh and kiss another man as if you don't even exist?" Alice's face crumpled, fresh tears spilling down her cheeks. "John, please. I was wrong. I was so wrong. But I swear, it's over. I ended it weeks ago. I wanted to tell you, but I was afraid. I thought I could fix this before you found out." "Fix this?" I said bitterly. "How do you fix something like this, Alice? How do you rebuild trust when it's been shattered into pieces?" "I don't know," she admitted, her voice breaking. "But I want to try. I want to make this right, if you'll let me. Please, John. I love you. I've always loved you." The weight of her words pressed down on me, but they couldn't reach the part of me that had already begun to detach. The part that knew we were too far gone. "I don't think love works that way," I said quietly, standing up. Alice looked up at me, her face full of desperation. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying," I replied, my voice steady now, "that I can't do this anymore. You made your choices, Alice, and now I'm making mine." She started to speak, but I held up a hand to stop her. "I'm leaving," I said simply. "I've already packed my things." Her eyes widened in panic. "John, wait. Don't go. Please, we can fix this. We can." "No," I interrupted, my voice firm. "We can't. You broke something that can't be fixed." The words hung between us, heavy and final. I turned and walked toward the door, ignoring the sound of her sobs behind me. As I stepped outside, the cold air hit my face, and for the first time in days, I felt like I could breathe. The weight of her betrayal still pressed against my chest, but with each step I took away from that house, it grew lighter. I didn't know what came next, but I knew one thing for certain: this chapter of my life was over. The small apartment I rented wasn't much, but it felt like a sanctuary, a place where I could finally begin to process what had happened. I spent the first few days in a haze, my phone turned off and my thoughts consumed by Alice's betrayal. I replayed our confrontation over and over, searching for some clarity, some way to make sense of it all. But the clarity never came. Instead, new questions started creeping in, questions I couldn't ignore. Alice's explanation had been shaky, riddled with half-truths and vague excuses. And the more I thought about it, the more certain I became that there was more to the story. That certainty solidified when I checked my email one evening. Among the usual spam and work messages was a notification from the cloud storage connected to my hidden cameras. I'd forgotten I'd set the system to back up recordings automatically. I hesitated, my finger hovering over the mouse. Did I really want to go through this again? But curiosity, or maybe something darker, compelled me. The first few clips were exactly what I expected: Alice and the men she'd brought into our home. Their laughter, their whispered conversations, their casual intimacy. But then, buried in the timeline, I found something that made my blood run cold. It wasn't Alice. It was one of the men, the older one with the salt and pepper hair. He wasn't with her this time. Instead, he was alone in our living room, pacing back and forth with his phone pressed to his ear. "She doesn't know," he said, his voice low and clipped. "I've got everything under control. She thinks this is just between us." He paused, listening to whoever was on the other end of the line. Then he laughed, a cold, humorless sound. "Relax. She's too scared to do anything. And the husband? Clueless. He's not a problem." My stomach churned as I watched him pocket his phone and casually pour himself a drink from my liquor cabinet. He looked so at ease, so at home, like he owned the place. Who the hell was he? I spent the next few hours combing through the footage, searching for anything that might give me answers. And slowly, a pattern began to emerge. This wasn't just an affair. The men Alice had been involved with weren't strangers, they were connected. Their visits overlapped, their conversations hinted at a shared purpose. One of them even mentioned money in passing, asking Alice if she'd transferred the rest yet. It all felt orchestrated, deliberate. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. Alice wasn't just lying to me, she was being used. The next day, I called Tom, the friend who'd helped me set up the cameras. I explained what I'd found, my voice shaky with disbelief. "I think this goes deeper than an affair," I said. "I need to know who these people are." Tom didn't hesitate. "Send me the footage," he said. "I'll run a check." By the time he called me back that evening, I was pacing my apartment, my nerves shot. His voice was grim when he spoke. "The older guy? His name's Victor Kane. He's a consultant, or at least that's what his official records say. But he's been tied to a few shady operations, fraud, extortion, even blackmail." I swallowed hard, my grip tightening on the phone. "And the others?" "Similar profiles. All of them have connections to high-stakes schemes. And here's the kicker, Victor was sued last year by a former employee for coercion and harassment. The case was settled quietly, but there's a lot of smoke around this guy." My head spun as Tom continued. "I think Alice got caught up in something she couldn't control. Maybe it started as an affair, but Victor doesn't strike me as the kind of guy who lets things stay simple. He probably saw an opportunity and exploited it." The words settled like a weight in my chest. Alice hadn't just betrayed me, she'd been manipulated, maybe even trapped. But that didn't absolve her. She could have told me. She could have asked for help. Instead, she'd lied, over and over, until there was nothing left of the life we'd built together. I didn't sleep that night. By morning, I knew what I had to do. I met Alice at a quiet cafe near her studio. She looked tired, her face pale and drawn. When she saw me, a flicker of hope crossed her expression, but it quickly faded when she noticed the folder in my hands. "I need you to be honest with me," I said, sliding the folder across the table. She opened it, her hands trembling as she flipped through the photos and documents Tom had compiled. "John, Stop," I interrupted, my voice cold. "No more lies. No more excuses. I know who Victor Kane is. I know what he's been doing. What I don't know is why you didn't come to me. Why you didn't trust me." Tears welled in her eyes as she looked at me. "I was scared," she whispered. "Victor, he has leverage on me. Debt, mistakes I made before we even met. He threatened to ruin everything, my career, my reputation, our life together." "So you let him use you?" I said, anger bubbling beneath the surface. "You let him turn our home into his playground?" "I thought I could handle it," she said, her voice breaking. "I thought if I kept him happy, he'd leave us alone. I was trying to protect you." "Protect me?" I repeated, incredulous. "By lying to my face? By sleeping with him?" She flinched, but I didn't care. The pain in my chest outweighed any sympathy I might have felt. "This isn't protection, Alice. It's betrayal." For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The cafe buzzed with quiet conversations around us, but it all felt distant, irrelevant. Finally, I stood, grabbing the folder. "I'll handle Victor. But after that, we're done." Her eyes widened in panic. "John, please. Don't do this. We can fix this. We can." "No," I said firmly. "You broke us, Alice. And no amount of apologies will put us back together." I walked away, leaving her sitting there, alone. The next few days were a blur of anger, resolve, and grim determination. I couldn't let Victor Kane and his schemes continue to linger in my life. He'd used Alice, invaded my home, and left destruction in his wake. Whatever power he thought he held, I was about to take it from him. With Tom's help, I gathered everything I needed. The footage, the financial connections, and details of his shady dealings, it was all there, a web of deceit that stretched far beyond Alice. Tom even managed to trace some of Victor's activities to illicit business dealings that could land him in prison if they were exposed. I didn't confront Victor directly. Men like him thrived on intimidation and manipulation. Instead, I sent everything to someone who could bring him down, a reporter eager for a story that would shake the city. The journalist promised to dig deep and ensure Victor's name was splashed across every headline. I didn't tell Alice what I'd done. She had enough to deal with, and as much as I despised what she'd done to me, I didn't want to see her completely destroyed. A week later, the headlines hit. Consultant tied to extortion and fraud exposed was plastered across newsstands, and Victor's face was everywhere. As I read the articles, detailing his manipulations and the lives he'd ruined, I felt a strange mix of satisfaction and emptiness. The man who had shattered my marriage was facing justice, but it didn't fix what had been broken. It took months to put the pieces of my life back together. After the confrontation in the cafe, I didn't see Alice again. She left me one last message, a long email filled with apologies, explanations, and pleas for forgiveness. I never replied. Instead, I focused on myself. The small apartment that once felt like a temporary refuge became my home. I redecorated, filling it with plants, books, and a few of my own photographs, pictures I'd taken years ago, back when life felt simple. One evening, as I sorted through an old box of belongings, I found a photo of Alice and me, taken during our first vacation together. We were standing on a beach, laughing as the wind whipped our hair. I stared at it for a long time before tucking it away. The memory didn't hurt as much anymore. It was just a fragment of a life that had ended, a chapter I'd finally closed. A few weeks later, I found myself at a park with my camera, something I hadn't touched since everything fell apart. The sunlight filtered through the trees, casting long shadows across the grass. Families picnicked, children laughed, and the world moved on around me. I raised the camera to my eye and focused on a couple sitting on a bench, their faces lit with quiet joy. The moment felt perfect, honest, unposed, and real. I snapped the picture, the click of the shutter breaking the silence in my heart. As I lowered the camera, I smiled for the first time in months. The past was behind me, a part of my story but no longer defining me. And for the first time in what felt like forever, I looked forward to the future, ready to frame my life in a new light. Subscribe to never miss a new story and discover even more captivating tales.